Building a DIY sim rig can save you hundreds of dollars compared to an off-the-shelf metal rig. But some people say that they're not strong enough for direct drive wheels and heavy braking, so today I'm putting mine to the ultimate test and finding its limits. By the end of this video, we'll answer 3 big questions. Can a DIY rig withstand maximum output from my huge direct drive wheel? Does it flex under heavy braking? And most importantly, does it actually feel good to drive, or does it shake too much? Now, you might be thinking, sure, a wood rig might feel fine at first, but it's bound to get weaker over time. And that's exactly why I'm the perfect guy to test this. You see, I built this rig 5 years ago, and in all that time, the only bolts I've touched and tightened on it were the ones holding my wheel and my handbrake together, because I upgraded those about 3 or 4 years into my sim driving journey. So today's test on my aging sim rig will be perfect to show us whether DIY builds wear out over time or if they're actually pretty resilient. Testing for vibrations and flex in a sim rig can be hard to capture on camera, but luckily I know of a highly advanced and very scientific Japanese technique for measuring sim rig stability. And if you've ever heard of Initial D, you can probably guess what it is right about now. That's right, we're going to use the Takumi scale to rate my DIY rig through each of these tests, and we're starting with steering stability. Let's start with some drifting. We'll blast up Scuba Fruit's line, and keeping the theme, we'll do it in an AE86. No pressure. None at all. For this test, I set my direct drive wheel to 100% force feedback, twice what I normally run. Honestly, it's uncomfortable and makes my driving worse, but that's the point. I want to exaggerate the forces to see how much vibration this DIY rig can handle. Let's start with the initiation phase. Whenever I initiate from grip, you'll see it in the water right away. It takes aggressive force to break traction, and that transfers strongly into the wheel deck. This is a great example of how vibrations in your rig don't just come from your hardware, they also come from you. Also, watch for the spikes in force from the handbrake, especially in underpowered cars where it's used to extend drifts and link corners. Handbrake is the most forceful way to shift the car's weight, and even watching real drift cars as a spectator, you can see the rear of the car squat sharply the moment the wheels lock. In real cars, I mainly notice this feedback through the seat, but it's really cool how the cup of water lets us see my direct drive wheelbase signaling this spike of force too. You'll see it if you watch the water when I clutch in and my arm drops off camera to pull the handbrake. Next, let's look at what's happening mid-drift. Once the car is sliding, it's mostly calm as I steer with the throttle. Clutch kicks mid-drift don't create much vibration, and smooth throttle lift transitions barely cause a ripple. The main source of vibration at this stage comes when I have to reposition my hands, and I go from pushing up on the wheel with one hand to pulling down with the other. That directional change in force causes small but noticeable shakes. During transitions, things get interesting. If the corners flow easily and I nail my weight transfer, I can smoothly transition the car to the perfect amount of angle and keep the water calm. But if my transition is too strong or too weak and I have to adjust, that added input starts to show. I often use what I call the finger slip technique, where I adjust the pressure of my fingers on the wheel to slow its rotation during transitions. If I do this smoothly, there's no movement in the water. But if I momentarily stop the wheel to let the car rotate more, and then let it self-steer freely again, the spike in vibration is immediate. This also happens if I'm late to release the wheel when starting a transition. The momentary drop in resistance as the car gets ready to snap in the other direction causes a single jolt in the water. Finally, there's feedback from the track itself. Hopping over rumble strips or grazing the front tire across a gutter all produce small jerks in the wheel, which show up in the water cup. These are exactly the kind of things you'd feel in real life, and my wheelbase does a great job reproducing those forces, although my rig could do better to resist them. So what does this all tell us? Even though we see a fair amount of movement from this maximum power drift test, I don't think focusing on the force feedback coming out of the wheelbase alone tells the whole story. And I say that because in my smoothest transitions, there were virtually no ripples in the water. And this means the way that I handled the wheel actually had a big impact. Now you might think you're off the hook if you have a budget wheel that makes low force feedback, but Keep in mind that while a Logitech wheel only makes 2 or 3 Newton meters of force, you could still get big vibrations from drifting on it because you have to overpower gear drive wheels to countersteer fast enough to keep from spinning out. That's where you'll see people talk about throwing the wheel. And you can bet if you're throwing the wheel, you're going to be putting a lot of vibrations into the wheel deck. Now let's try out grip driving. This is where most sim racers crank up the force feedback and where I originally expected any weak points in the rig to show up. We'll drive the Tsukuba circuit and use a 370Z to see how grip driving compares to drifting. This time, everything's about smoothness and precision, not aggression. And honestly, I was shocked by how stable the water was. When I'm driving cleanly, turn in, shifting, and corner exit barely create any movement in the water. Even rumble strips only cause a small vibration. The first time I saw real vibration in the cup during a grip lap was while heel-toe downshifting, especially mid-corner. I think that's happening for 2 reasons. First, physically twisting my leg and foot to match revs causes a small shift in body position, and some of that force gets transferred into the rig. Second, bringing my hand back to the wheel after shifting tends to introduce a slight jolt, similar to what we saw when adjusting my hand position while drifting. Mid-corner upshifts can also produce a visible spike in the water when I re-grip the wheel during cornering load. When I shift in a straight line, though, the water stays perfectly calm. That tells me most of the vibrations aren't coming from the shifter or pedal work, they're coming from the human factor, my body moving in the seat and the shift in force as I grip the wheel after changing gears. The only other time I saw significant vibration came when I got a little too much slip angle on corner exit, where there was a noticeable shudder as the rear tires regained grip. This was definitely coming from the steering wheel. It's brief, but visible, and it's something you feel in a real car too. Overall, grip driving at this level of force feedback is surprisingly calm. As long as my inputs stay clean, the rig stays stable. So, what have we learned? First, we've seen that drifting will definitely produce more vibration than grip driving. I knew the small inputs and focus on balance of grip racing would upset the water less, but I was surprised by how big the difference was. I bet there are sim rigs on the market that feel great to grip race on that would feel rickety if you tried drifting. So, be sure to seek out drift-specific feedback if that's important to you. Second, the wheel deck here is one of the most vulnerable parts of a sim rig, so you've got to make sure it's sturdy and well built. The vertical posts for the wheel deck are an easy place for vibrations to get through depending on the strength of the joints, and it makes sense why the top class metal sim rigs use extra thick aluminum for their uprights and then these huge metal plates to bolt them on to the horizontal runners that sit on the floor. This makes a much stronger connection than 2x4s held in place with 3 wood screws, which is what the joints on my DIY rig uses. And you can see it's somewhat resistant to forward and back motion, but it's pretty weak against side-to-side motion. Next, let's look at how strong the sim rig is at the pedals by checking for vibrations there. We'll start with the drift test. This is a driving style known for its sharp pedal work with lightning-fast clutch kicks and stabbing, throttle, and braking inputs. While drifters do also use the foot brake, sliding the car creates a lot of drag, so you'll probably see stronger braking forces in our grip test coming up a little later. I'm putting our water cup on the side rail of my sim rig, which is as close to the pedals as I can get without ruining them in the event something goes wrong. We're conducting our drift test at Meihan, a track known for the aggressive first corner entries made by Japanese legends like Naoki Nakamura. I've turned the wheelbase force feedback down to my usual preference, so we won't get any misleading signals coming from my inputs at the wheel deck. My favorite drift entry at Meihan involves short shifting up the third gear to control wheel speed and maximize acceleration on the run-up, then using a feint entry and relying mainly on big angle to slow the car, during which time I'll downshift to second and then power out of the first corner. The rest of the track flows well and can be completed with only throttle steering. As I drove the track and then reviewed my footage, I was surprised by what I saw. Clutch kicks and sharp throttle modulation seem to cause almost no vibration in the water cup, even during aggressive corner entries. While some drifters use foot brake on the entry to Meihan, I can usually get away with just slowing the car through massive angle, so we'll take a closer look at how much vibration heavy braking creates when we move on to the grip driving test. Haha, wall tap. but in general, the pedal area of the rig seems incredibly solid throughout the whole track. Unlike the brake, the clutch and throttle pedals have low resistance, so even rough inputs don't create many ripples in the water. I even started trying for wall taps on corner entry to see what happened there. Two for two on the wall taps, although that one is a little hard. But again, the pedal area was rock solid, even with the car scraping the wall. As I reviewed the footage, the main thing I kept coming back to was that even after turning down the force feedback of my wheel, the biggest vibrations still seemed to come into my sim rig at the wheel deck. In these laps, that happened when I'd throw the wheel in hard for a big entry, but even those were fairly small now that the force feedback was lower. But how does this compare to grip racing? I'm taking the iconic Toyota Supra through the C1 on Tokyo's Shuto Expressway, and we'll focus on the most intense braking zones, right at the end of a high-speed straight, where I need to use threshold braking to go from top speed into a second gear hairpin. I was having a blast ripping down the Tokyo Expressways, so I shot a fair bit of footage, but honestly, there's no need to watch all of it. This clip sums it up really well. Whether it was upshifts, downshifts, or even heavy braking, in grip there were minimal vibrations at the pedal deck of my sim rig, no matter what I did. It was rock solid. Even my heel-toe downshifts were steady in grip. I wish I could show you more of this footage, but there's just nothing more to see. Pedal vibration is a non-issue when grip racing on my DIY rig, and even drifting isn't a major concern. Now that we've tested how much flex there is, let's start unpacking the big question. How does it feel to drive, and is it good enough? First of all, I do still think an aluminum profile cockpit has less flex and vibrations than a DIY rig. I also think if you ask online, you'll hear that the goal is zero flex, and anything less means you're losing performance. Maybe that's not wrong, but it highlights something that I feel gets exaggerated in the sim racer, PC builder, and gamer scene. A lot of folks are quick to obsess over what I call perfection on paper, even to the point of keeping your CPU 1 degree cooler, getting an extra 5 FPS, or improving your car setup by like 0.5%. These improvements are objectively better, but don't forget to work equally hard on your actual driving technique and your mental toughness, because otherwise when the pressure's on, you might find yourself getting outperformed by a guy on a G29 clamped to a desk in his dorm room. In other words, somebody who actually spends all that time driving instead of comparing benchmarks. For most drivers, the performance of a DIY rig is good enough, and I don't think a minor improvement in reducing chassis flex will unlock tons of hidden driving prowess. Let's not forget that if you step into a real drift car or a purpose-built race car, there's always flex and vibration coming from all kinds of places. You've got tire deflection and suspension movement, and yeah, even the car's frame flexes. It's all part of how a car reacts under load in the real world. In most sim rigs, the steering wheel is your only source of feedback. But when I'm in my real car, blasting sideways down the track a few feet from my buddies, with like pebbles and tire dust bouncing off my helmet and prickling against my neck and forearms, the feedback that's coming through the wheel is definitely not my primary focus. It's much more about managing rear tire grip, from feeling vibrations coming up through the chassis, and you actually feel those through the seat, not the wheel. When it comes to real-life motorsports, your hands and your feet tell you what's happening at the front tires. You'll feel the traction of the front tires fall off slowly in the steering wheel, or sharply if you've locked the fronts or triggered ABS under braking. Meanwhile, your butt will tell you what's happening with the rear tires. You'll actually feel the car get light and floaty as you approach the limits of traction on corner exit, or the grip will fall off quickly if you're a drifter and you just mash the throttle or do a clutch kick. Last but not least, your general sense of balance will tell you what's happening with the car's stability overall, and for drifting, its rate of angle gain, like how quickly you're picking up more angle and getting more sideways. Now obviously, sim rig flex is different. In a real car, most of the components that move are supposed to, and it's mainly the chassis and like the seat that flex needlessly. In a sim rig, where you're not moving through space or applying weight transfer, only the force of the hardware and the driver inputs are at play. So if a sim rig flexes too much, especially inconsistently, it can absolutely wreck your performance. For example, if your wheel is clamped to a rickety old desk that visibly wobbles when you steer, or this is my favorite, if you play in an office chair and it creeps away from your pedals under hard braking, you're going to have trouble. But as long as the flex is consistent and predictable, like it is on my DIY sim rig, I don't think it's a big deal. The same thing happens in real cars, and learning to separate the useful signals from the noise of chassis flex is just part of developing your skill as a driver. So after everything I've tested, here's my final take. Yeah, in a perfect world you'd want zero flex. But in reality, as long as your rig is sturdy, consistent, and doesn't create unpredictable movements, some minor flex isn't going to ruin your experience. In fact, if you've never driven a real drift or sports car before, you might actually overestimate how stiff it should feel. If you're building a rig for maximum force feedback detail, then yeah, going a full aluminum profile is a no-brainer. But for drivers on a budget, and most drivers in general, this thing holds up way better than most people would expect. And I think it's got what it takes to carry you far on your sim racing journey, if you're cool with living the DIY sim rig lifestyle. But what's it actually like to live with one of these DIY rigs long term? I've certainly learned a thing or two over the last 5 and 6 years. Click here to find out what held up, what didn't, and whether I'd still build it again today.